in nonviolent civil disobedience.
To follow that breaking news in Albany, where a large group of protesters have moved back into the street.
Today's Poor People's Campaign rally, part of simultaneous rallies in more than 30 states and Washington, D.C.
Over the past 5 weeks, nearly 2,000 people have been arrested in what organizers describe as the most expansive wave of nonviolent direct action this century.
Our backs are against the wall, and we got no choice but to push.
Because it's crucial that we make ourselves heard.
For a country this rich to have so many people poor, it's immoral and it's wrong.
We testified on Capitol Hill.
Never before have impacted leaders gotten to march into Congress and present a budget.
We brought a full budget request and a movement behind it.
During the pandemic, we organized the largest social media gathering of the poor in U.S. history.
We mobilized, we organized, we registered, and we educated poor voters across the country.
And we helped bring poverty to the national agenda.
Something that hasn't come up very much tonight, but deserves a lot of attention: poverty. You know, the Poor People's Campaign is marching on Iowa right now, calling on us to talk about this issue more.
Ending poverty will not just be an aspiration. It will be a theory of change to build a new economy that includes everyone.
Our country now stands at a tipping point. We can realize a third Reconstruction to fully address poverty and low wages from the bottom up.
Today we say to poor people, Mr. Speaker, we see you and we will eradicate poverty in our country with you.
No democracy can claim to be strong when 140 million people, or 43% of its people, are poor and low wealth.
Now, we're organizing to realize a third Reconstruction. It's time to fully address poverty and low wages from the bottom up. We are fighting forward together.
And not one step back.
I want you to know that when hands that once picked cotton join hands of Latinos, join hands of progressive whites, join faith hands and labor hands and Asian hands and Native American hands and poor hands and wealthy hands with a conscience and gay hands and straight hands and trans hands and Christian hands and Jewish hands and Muslim hands and Hindu hands and Buddhist hands. When we all get together, we are an instrument of redemption. When we join hands, we can revive and make sure that the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and equal protection under the law is never taken away from anybody. So I got a question. Are the rejected ready to revive and declare that this land is your land, this land is my land, this land is our land, and together from the State House to the White House, the rejected are going to demand that this nation never give up on being one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
In 2018, there were 140 million Americans who were poor or one emergency away from economic ruin.
Across the country, in communities and forgotten places, poor people and low-wage workers of different races, genders, abilities, sexualities, and faiths are building a moral fusion movement.
We are coming together across all the lines that divide us to restructure and lift our society from the bottom up.
We delivered our demands.
We demand.
We demand.
We demand.
We demand an immediate implementation of federal and state living wage laws.
We demand an immediate restoration of the Voting Rights Act.
We engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience.
You can follow that breaking news in Albany, where a large group of protesters have moved back into the street.
Today's Poor People's Campaign rally, part of simultaneous rallies in more than 30 states and Washington, D.C.
Over the past 5 weeks, nearly 2,000 people have been arrested in what organizers describe as the most expansive wave of nonviolent direct action this century.
Our backs are against the wall, and we got no choice but to push.
Because it's crucial that we make ourselves heard.
For a country this rich to have so many people poor, it's immoral and it's wrong.
We testified on Capitol Hill.
Never before have impacted leaders gotten to march into Congress and present a budget.
We brought a full budget request and a movement behind it.
During the pandemic, we organized the largest social media gathering of the poor in U.S. history.
We mobilized, we organized, we registered, and we educated poor voters across the country.
And we helped bring poverty to the national agenda.
Something that hasn't come up very much tonight, but deserves a lot of attention: poverty. You know, the Poor People's Campaign is marching on Iowa right now, calling on us to talk about this issue more.
Ending poverty will not just be an aspiration. It will be a theory of change to build a new economy that includes everyone.
Our country now stands at a tipping point. We can realize a third Reconstruction to fully address poverty and low wages from the bottom up.
Today we say to poor people, Mr. Speaker, we see you and we will eradicate poverty in our country with you.
No democracy can claim to be strong when 140 million people, or 43% of its people, are poor and low wealth.
Now, we're organizing to realize a third Reconstruction. It's time to fully address poverty and low wages from the bottom up. We are fighting forward together
and not one step back.
I want you to know that when hands that once picked cotton join hands of Latinos, join hands of progressive whites, join faith hands and labor hands and Asian hands and Native American hands and poor hands and wealthy hands with a conscience and gay hands and straight hands and trans hands and Christian hands and Jewish hands and Muslim hands and Hindu hands and Buddhist hands, when we all get together, we are an instrument of redemption. When we join hands, we can revive and make sure that the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and equal protection under the law is never taken away from anybody. So I got a question. Are the rejected ready to revive and declare that this land is your land, this land is my land, this land is our land, and together from the State House to the White House, the rejected are going to demand that this nation never give up on being one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
nobody.
Turn me around.
No,
Turn me around.
no,
Turn me around.
gonna let nobody.
Turn me around.
I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking,
Walking up to freedom land.
I ain't gonna let no closed door.
Turn me around.
No,
Turn me around.
no,
Turn me around.
gonna let no closed door.
Turn me around.
I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking.
Walking up to freedom land.
I ain't gonna let nobody.
Turn me around. Turn me around. Turn me around.
Ain't gonna let nobody.
Turn me around.
I'm gonna,
Keep on walking.
I'm gonna,
Keep on talking.
I'm gonna,
Walking up to freedom land.
ain't gonna let no senator.
Turn me around. Turn me around. Turn me around.
Gonna let no senator.
Turn me around.
I'm gonna,
Keep on walking.
I'm gonna,
Keep on talking. Walking up to freedom land.
ain't gonna let nobody.
Turn me around.
No,
Turn me around.
no,
Turn me
no,
around.
ain't gonna let nobody.
Turn me around.
I'm gonna,
Keep on walking. Keep on talking. Walking up to freedom land.
ain't gonna let no handcuffs.
Turn me around.
No,
Turn me around.
no,
Turn me around.
ain't gonna let no handcuffs.
Turn me
I'm
around.
gonna,
Keep on walking.
I'm gonna.
Keep on talking. Walking up to freedom.
Let me hear you say, I ain't gonna let nobody.
Turn me around. Turn me around. Turn me around. Turn me around. Keep on walking. Keep on talking. Walking up to freedom.
Ain't gonna let no governor. Come on.
Turn me around. Turn me around. Turn me around. Turn me around. Keep on walking. Keep on
Okay, y'all.
talking.
This is live stream. Everybody turn around and look at the camera and say, ain't gonna let nobody.
Turn me around.
No,
Turn me around.
no,
Turn me around.
gonna let nobody.
Turn me around.
I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, walking up to freedom.
Gracious God, we always seek your help and ask you to strengthen and to keep us and to use us for your glory. In your precious name we pray, and in all that is holy, amen. Democracy versus autocracy is the battle of our time. I want to thank all of you for joining in and sharing this link throughout the nation. We fully believe that we must engage and escalate the nonviolent moral struggle for a third Reconstruction. When we commemorate the pivotal moments in human history, we rarely remember times of peace and tranquility. No, the truth is, It has always been in the face of adversity and challenge that we have come together to find a better way forward. The future is always forged by those who recognize the fierce urgency of a necessary struggle. Since I'm a preacher, and on behalf of Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, the co-chair, who's also a preacher, I can tell you that this is true of the biblical record. The prophets of ancient Israel, in texts that are honored by Jews, Muslims, and Christians and others, always cried aloud when the leaders grew callous and the poor suffered. In Isaiah 10, for instance, the prophet declares, "Woe, stop, hold up, quit it," to those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights. This was the pronouncement of Isaiah in his day. Jesus in his day challenged the political and the religious leaders when they engaged in filibustering the truth and filibustering justice. He said, "Whoa, hold it, stop, you hypocrites who nitpick about rules, about religious minutia, but you forget the weightier matters of the law, which is justice and mercy." We remember the prophets because they understood the urgency of the moment in which they lived. Things could not continue with the imbalance between those who abuse power and those who suffer at their hands. No, something had to give. And the prophets are the ones who saw that change is non-negotiable. And my brothers and our sisters, I want you to hear me with complete attention. I'm asking even the sound folk to sit down and stop moving so it won't distract me. This must happen now. Continued compromise with evil in this moment is not an option. This is also true in our more recent history. The holiday we some pause to celebrate today does not simply commemorate the birth of the idea of America or the grand vision of democracy, because even the birth was flawed, and even at the birthing, freedom and justice was aborted. No, we have to pause even as we remember how after a long train of abuses, some imperfect men recognized the urgency of the moment. They risked everything by signing their names to a writ of rebellion against the government that did not recognize them as equals, even as they wrote inequality in the very document they signed. But they didn't declare, at least they said they didn't declare their independence because they were certain they could win. They did it because they recognized the urgency of the moment. They recognized compromise with the British crown was no longer an option. I just wish they had recognized that continued compromise and commitment with the genocide of Native people and the enslavement of African people was also no longer an option. Likewise, the truest patriots in America has known, that we've known, have been those who took that flawed document and amended it and transformed it, because in their own day, they knew how they could no longer accept what Dr. King called one time the high blood pressure of creeds and the anemia of deeds. They could no longer accept the compromises that denied their pure humanity and right to live as equal citizens in this land. And so those who continued to try to birth this nation, to make it truly a nation of more freedom, a more perfect union, were the abolitionists, the women's suffragists, the labor activists, the welfare rights unions, the LGBTQ activists, the civil rights activists, and today's young climate activists, and all of you who make up the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Each in their own day then and in our day now have recognized now is the time, right now, and we cannot compromise. The moral crisis of our moment demands our actions. Well, I want to call a couple of witnesses today. Since I am in church standing at this pulpit, I want to call them to testify in length to the reality we face. And that the challenge before us, as I have said, is democracy versus autocracy. This is the battle of our time. But don't simply take my word. Listen to these other experts. I want to call to the stand a witness today to testify the Institute for Policy Studies. My good friend Phyllis Bennett's and others' work. And they have issued a report that lays out how the wealth of U.S. billionaires, listen now, has grown tremendously during the pandemic. And they've increased their wealth in a way that the increase alone could pay for a majority of President Joe Biden's new infrastructure and jobs plan. And this has happened while millions more have fallen into the already 140 million poor and low wealth people that existed in this country prior to the pandemic, and the more than 50% of our children. And the many, many millions of people who lost their jobs, the poorest among us who we call essential workers, but have treated them as though they were expendable, and they became the first to have to go to work, the first to get sick, the first to get infected, the first to go to the hospital, and the first to die. And yet, according to the testimony of the Institute of Policy Study and their other partners, between March of 2020 and right now, the 719 U.S. billionaires' collective wealth has grown 55%. Their combined wealth grew from 2.9 trillion to 4.56 trillion, a growth of 1.62 trillion. Just the increase in their wealth could cover 70% of Biden's 2.25 trillion proposal to create jobs and invest in human and otherwise infrastructure across the U.S. And yet we have politicians saying, we don't have the money, it's too much. Let me let them testify more, the Institute for Policy Study. I want them to testify and link, just using my voice. Their report says billionaire wealth growth has perversely accelerated over the year and a half of the global pandemic. But the piling up of the fortunes at the top has proceeded at a rapid clip for decades. In other words, it didn't just start. And this has been going on even as the net worth of working Americans lagged and public services deteriorated. In fact, they bring in another testifier. Report from the Rand Corporation last year estimated that in a normal year, $2.5 trillion is transferred from the bottom 90% of Americans to a portion of the top 1%, not even the whole 1%, just a portion. I want to talk about redistribution of wealth. Is from the bottom up. And since 1975, the richest Americans have rigged the tax system to take more than $50 trillion from most of us. And so according to this report, we really are not free. We've been enslaved to trickle-down economics and neoliberalism that continues to transfer money from the poor and the working poor to a small percentage of the top 1%. As the Institute continues to testify, they tell in that study that back in 1990, the bottom 50% of the U.S. had more collective wealth than billionaires by a $140 billion margin. But because of the continued accumulation of wealth at the top, the rigging of the system, the cutting of taxes and making the poor and working poor and others have to pay more than the billionaires. Now, U.S. billionaires own over 4.5 times the amount of wealth as those who make up the bottom 50% of the economic scale, roughly 165 million Americans. This kind of economic disparity is leading us more toward autocracy than democracy. During the pandemic, we've watched this scheme turn into a bonanza. Says the report, the wealth of people over 100 billion grew hand and fist during the pandemic. Elon Musk's wealth increased nearly sixfold during the pandemic to 172 billion. According to the report, the wealth of Amazon's Jeff Bezos grew by 74% during the last 13 months to a total of 197 billion. Yes, he gave $10 million to some groups to say he was concerned about Black Lives Matter, a measly $10 million, not even a tip. But then the next day he cut the hazard pay of those working in his plants in Amazon factories, distribution points. And Mark Zuckerberg's wealth more than doubled in a little over a year during the pandemic to 113.5 billion. Meanwhile, some of the CEOs who have profited the most from the pandemic treat their workers the worst. The Brookings Institute found that of the 13 major retail companies, according to the report, that have experienced pandemic windfall, in other words, they made money during the pandemic, Amazon and Walmart are among the companies that compensate their workers the worst, while forcing them to work through dangerous conditions as frontline workers, because you know the frontline workers are essential workers. They can't go home, someone said. They have to cut our meat. They have to deliver our groceries. They have to serve us, even if serving means they are were served up to death during this pandemic. I tell you, the level of greed is obscene. And by itself, just these facts alone about the economic realities demand that we act, and we act now. But it is not all. It's not all that's wrong. It's not all that has caused democracy versus autocracy to be the battle of our times. Because at the same time, we are seeing this grotesque and pornographic grabbing of wealth. We also see the same people with the same money who have the same politicians on their support list. The same people who are consumed by greed publicly are working to undermine democracy and voting politically. Or let me call another witness and listen to this in-depth analysis by my dear friend Ari Berman. I need to recount it in its fullness because of the urgency of now. He wrote, and I know Ari would be okay with me quoting him, where he said, listen deeply and listen in length. The Supreme Court upheld 2 Republican-backed voting restrictions in the state of Arizona this past Thursday, giving a green light to Republican efforts to make it harder for Democratic-leaning constituencies to vote. And I love that he says constituencies, because he doesn't just say black folk, because the attack we see now is not Jim Crow. It's James Crow Esquire, and it has an impact across the board. Then my dear brother goes on to say, the court gave its blessings to two laws passed by Arizona's GOP-controlled legislature. One, preventing anyone but a voter's family member or caregiver from returning a mail-in ballot. That's targeted directly at our indigenous brothers and sisters like the Apache Nation and also black people and poor people. And another one throwing out votes cast in the wrong precincts. That had been struck down in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. But now you understand why Mitch McConnell would use 51 votes to put Supreme Court justices in a lifetime position on the Supreme Court, but then refuses to use 51 votes to pass voting rights, because this was struck down by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in January, and they said that it discriminated against Native Americans, listen, Latinos and black voters, which also means that it would have an impact on poor people and poor white folk. Now, Justice Samuel Alito told the truth, even in the ugliness of this decision. He told the truth that we need to hear. Writing for the 6-3 conservative majority, says Ari, he argued that, listen now, disparate impact among racial or ethnic groups isn't enough to make voting laws illegal. Let me translate what Ari is saying. That Alito says, oh, a little racism ain't all that bad. Just because it discriminates doesn't mean it's illegal. Now, I thought the 14th Amendment says that we have equal protection under the law, all persons. But listen to what this justice said. This is a justice. This is a justice on the Supreme Court. The mere fact that there is some disparity in impact does not necessarily mean that a system is not equally open or that it does not give everyone an equal opportunity to vote. These are the same arguments that were made to justify a poll tax and to justify literacy tests. The difference is then it was only toward black people. But now the way it's being rolled out is literally going after anyone in the democracy who believes in progress rather than retrogression. And so 17 states now, says Ari, have passed 28 new laws this year restricting access to the ballot. According to the Brennan Center, another testifier, the Brennan Center for Justice, in response, Democrats have filed a flurry of lawsuits to block them. And Republicans have already admitted, they aren't even in court yet, but Ari makes the point, they've already admitted that they are passing the law for partisan gain. No, we're not doing this for racial purposes. We're doing this for partisan gain. But the partisan gain has racial overtones and racial realities and class disparities. During an oral argument, Ari says, in the case, Michael Carvin, a lawyer for the Republican National Committee, said that striking down restrictions on voting puts us at a competitive disadvantage relative to Democrat. Translation, if you let everybody vote, we can't win because they don't agree with our ideas. And so the only way we can win is you got to let us restrict the vote. And we won't say we're doing it because we're trying to go after black folk or brown folk or native. We'll say we're doing it because we're just trying to be partisan, which is another way, another cover-up for violating the law. And the decision on Thursday, says Ari, signals that a conservative-dominated judiciary, which includes now 3 Supreme Court justices nominated by Donald Trump, and one of them was put on the bench in the middle of the pandemic, when Mitch McConnell and his band of senators were more interested in replacing our dear sister on the bench of the Supreme Court. He's more concerned about putting someone on the court than he was about keeping people out of caskets. And this decision says that they will not stand in the way, says Brother Berman, of the greatest rollback of voting rights since the end of the first Reconstruction in the 19th century. 200 scholars of democracy in this same article written by Ari, he notes that 200 scholars have warned in a dire letter they work for the think tank, they did it for the think tank called New America, and these 200 scholars said this: our entire democracy is now at risk. Our entire democracy is at risk. Ruth Bader Ginsburg tried to warn us of this in 2013. They said, as hundreds of Republican-sponsored bills in states across the country threat to either block or exhaust voters until they just quit, because there's data that says for every 1 hour people have to stay an extra hour in line, thousands of people just don't even come back or either just leave the line. And they want to block or exhaust voters to the point of surrender. And the letter from these authors warned that the recent deterioration of U.S. elections means that several states no longer even meet the minimum conditions for free and fair elections. And then finally he says, in the long run, says Ari, the experts argue, the United States of America, listen to me, could soon become a country of extended minority rule. We already have a country where the majority of those who, large majority of the senators in the Senate come from the states with the least population. But we could become a country of an extended minority rule, which then will call into question whether the United States of America can even remain a democracy, since majority opinion will be increasingly unable to shape government decisions. And without aggressive federal intervention, Republicans could reverse the outcomes of a free and fair election, making the sloppy attempt by Trump and his backers to overturn the 2020 results look like amateurish attempts by comparison. Now, it's strange for me as a black man and a man who's also part Native American to even talk about majority rule, because there was a time when segregation was majority rule. That's what people wanted. And we had to trust the federal government and the courts to challenge, because that majority rule was unjust, and mobs can be unjust. But what they're talking about here is when the majority of people want to follow the Constitution and want to follow that nobody has the right to abridge or deny the right to vote, and want to follow the equal protection under the law, that we're headed to a place where majority opinion could increasingly be unable to shape government decisions if we allow this vast, vast, vast inequality in wealth and this continuing attack on fundamental voting rights. The last line in that study that Ari Berman lays out says, this is bleak stuff for a country that democracy experts have already labeled a civil oligarchy, that we're already a civil oligarchy, where we treat corporations like people and people like things, where money has too much play, and always has, but has too much play in our political outcomes. In a Cambridge University press study, they used that word, civil oligarchy, and they said where economic elites and business interests enjoy massive influence over policies, while the average citizens have little or no independent influence. And the success of the extremists who have hijacked the Republican Party and those in the Democratic Party that they have been able to attract, even though they may call themselves Democrat, their success depends on banishing voters they don't like from the political landscape. And the reason is straightforward. They know that essentially no one likes their ideas. They know that people have deep trust for the oligarchy and the ruling wealthy elite that want to take everything unto themselves. They know that they have failed to persuade a lasting majority of Americans that corporations should answer to no one. Listen to Ari. And that inequality is a natural phenomenon. Preach, Ari. And that weaker nations must be strong, armed into obediently serving American interests. And so Ari concludes, and I agree, that the only remaining option then, as the country becomes increasingly repellent to these extremist ideas, is to make sure that the majority who opposes them can't govern. And then he ends with this quote. As the New York Times' Ezra Klein says, Republicans are setting off a doom loop for democracy. And when you listen to the testimony from the Institute of Policy Study and the Brennan Institute and the 200 scholars and my dear friend Ari Berman and others that he brought into his article, and I wanted to lay this out today, because this is a time when bumper sticker speeches and stuff is not going to work. We need to understand the depth of the problem, the chains, if you will, Nancy McClain, that people are putting on this democracy. And when we understand it and understand our moral responsibility, then we know that democracy versus autocracy is the battle of our time. And if that's so, if that's the diagnosis, then we must escalate and engage a nonviolent moral struggle for a third Reconstruction. We must have moral, masked, nonviolent, direct moral action. We must have massive voter registration and participation. We must have more litigation. And we must have meaningful legislation in the fight for a third Reconstruction. And we can never allow our prophetic discontent to be muted. Now is the moment, we must remember, when those who came before us, they faced trying times. And they met the challenge by recognizing the urgency of the moment and the demands of that moment. And when we remember them, we cannot back down. We cannot compromise. We must act now. Democracy's defenders, we can defeat today's attempts to subvert the will of the people by using the same tools used to overthrow its Jim Crow forefather. In fact, we can do it in a way that may even win some of those who are on the wrong side. We know that in the time before us, federal action was needed to protect equal access of all citizens to the ballot and to guarantee free and fair elections. It's going to require, y'all, it's going to require an abolishing or a major reforming of the filibuster, the non-constitutional filibuster. That old Senate rule that was begun to block anti-slavery legislation but has been used to try to block women's rights and labor rights and workers' rights and civil rights. And it makes it essentially impossible to pass anything without a 60-vote majority. And so you give 59 or 60 senators the power over the millions of the rest of us. And now we got Joe Manchin saying he's not changing the filibuster. And some people are ready to run and tuck their tails in between their legs. But those who think Manchin is immovable forget that he's still a politician who responds to prevailing political winds. And 79% of West Virginians, white folk from the holler, black folk from the hood, don't agree with him. And if we mobilize in nonviolent direct action with a moral focus, we can make him hear them and hear us. And the same is true with Sinema in Arizona. There were those in years past, you got to remember, when the Voting Rights Act was first passed, it was not because they had the votes at the beginning. There was filibustering then. There were those who said they would do it forever. But the prevailing winds, political winds, were changed by those who dared to take nonviolent, moral, direct action. Right now, Sinema and Manchin can hold their allegiance to the National Chamber of Commerce, because that's who's really backing them, the money. And the reason they can do that is because they have not faced the full force of nonviolent, moral, direct action in the streets and in the political suites. Just meeting with them is not going to change them. Just send them a text message or email. No. This is the moment now. And we must be clear. We don't want an insurrection. We want a moral resurrection. The only reliable way to change the political terrain and how policymakers behave is to take the demands to the streets in our deepest moral and nonviolent direct actions. It's no surprise then that GOP politicians and their corporate backers, they tremble at the thought of genuine democracy. That's why they're trying to write rules to disable us from marching. But when you engage in moral, nonviolent direct action, if a law is passed and it's an unjust law to shut down your voice, you're willing to break that law for a higher purpose. They know, the extremists know, that every time progress has been achieved, it's been progress because popular movements have exerted enough pressure to make the elites comply. And so, my brothers and sisters, this is no time to waste. Democracy versus autocracy is the battle of our time. We must engage and escalate the nonviolent moral struggle and direct action for a third Reconstruction. Doesn't all have to come under one umbrella, but it must come all over the country. It's time to make ending poverty a top legislative priority. It's time to guarantee and protect and extend voting rights. It's time to update the poverty measure. It's time to expand democratic participation, protecting the right to vote and pushing back these recent flood of voter suppression law. It's time to protect the constitutional right of assembly and free speech. It's time to ensure that legislation that improved the condition of the 140 million that was passed in response to the pandemic, that all of those protections are extended and made permanent, from child and social welfare programs to SNAP, to WHIP, to child tax credit, to economic earned income tax credits, moratoriums on all evictions. It's time to fully protect undocumented people who even in this pandemic work to serve this nation. It's time to raise the minimum wage to a living wage of $15. It's time to guarantee the right to form and join unions. It's time, because all of those who fight against these things are the ones supporting the greed and supporting the takeover of our democratic processes and voter suppression. It's time to enact fair taxes on corporations. It's time to repeal the 2017 tax cuts. It's time to have a proper measurement of poverty so we truly measure what poverty and low wealth looks like. It's time to go to work. It's time, past time, to guarantee quality health care for everybody and universal single-payer health care for everybody. It's time to guarantee safe and quality housing for all and safe and quality water for all. It's time to pass and implement a federal jobs program, not to cut it, but to raise it even more. What we need is $6 to $10 trillion to ensure good jobs and increase public investment and infrastructure and institutions in poor and low-income communities that prioritize green and socially beneficial industries and address inequality in both rural and urban areas that lift all people regardless of their race, their creed, their color. It's time to guarantee quality, safe, and equitable public education and accessible education infrastructure from pre-K to 12. It's time to ensure that people can get a college education. It's time to have relief from student debt and medical debt and housing debt and utilities debt. It's time to enact comprehensive and just immigration reform. It's time to ensure all the rights of indigenous people and tribal nations, including their right to free expression of their religion and the right to their native lands, is protected. It's time to embrace a bold agenda to transform the economy away from climate chaos to a green, renewable energy economy. It's time to demilitarize the U.S. foreign policy by cutting budgets. It's time to cut the military budget by 10% immediately and put that money in infrastructure, jobs, and anti-poverty programs. It's time to end unjust mass incarceration and violent policing. It's time, even if it means deficit spending now, to invest in a future tomorrow. It's time. And it's not going to get done just with a rally here and a meeting over there and just an email. No, this is the time for us to engage in massive, nonviolent, moral, direct action in this moment, connected to massive voter registration, connected to mass litigation, and connected to meaningful legislation. And so to set the example, to hopefully call others to this moment, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and our other major partners have decided it's time to launch a season of nonviolent moral direct action. You know, when it was launched in Montgomery, then it broke out everywhere else. And it wasn't just one banner, but it broke out. This loving militancy aims to apply pressure and call on everybody to do the same. And join us not only in rallies and marches, but also in nonviolent moral direct action. And if people choose to want to arrest us for engaging in our constitutional right, then we will submit through civil disobedience. But we've got to do this to move the United States Senate and move our political structures, because we're in a moment now that the battle is between democracy and autocracy. We must engage in this. We must demand that the Senate do its job. Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1 of the Constitution. The time, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But, here's the clause, and while Manchin and Sinema and them are wrong when they say that there should not be these changes, the Congress may at any time, by law, make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of the choosing of senators. The Congress has the right, the moral authority, when it sees the state legislatures doing wrong, to change the laws and the regulation. We must engage in nonviolent, direct moral action to stop the filibuster. We must push for the full John Lewis. And yes, the real John Lewis bill is the For the People Act. That's what he worked on. We must push for the full John Lewis bill, the For the People Act, full, not compromise, and voting rights restoration. The Voting Rights Act restoration. We must push and demand passage of a $15 minimum wage. And we must say all of this must be done by August the 6th, which is the anniversary, the 56th anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it is a damnable shame that 56 years after the signing of the Voting Rights Act in 65, we have less voting rights today because of all the gutting than we had on August 6th and August 7th of 1965. And so we're launching our Moral Mondays. And when our Moral Mondays, National Moral Mondays on July 12th, there will be a massive national call-in to every senator to shut down the switchboard if necessary, because the first goal of nonviolent direct action is to make sure folk know what your demands are and give them an opportunity to address them. And then on July 19th, the anniversary of the Women's Convention at Seneca Falls, women have already said and called from all over the nation they will want to engage in nonviolent moral direct action in D.C. And then on July 26th, in all Senate offices, regardless of party, around the country, in at least 45 states, people will engage in nonviolent moral direct action and go in and ask Senator, where do you stand on ending the filibuster, regardless of your party? Where do you stand on fully supporting the Voting Rights Act and fully supporting the real John Lewis bill, the For the People Act? And where you stand on that will determine how we stand or how we sit in. On August 2nd, a mass number of clergy, religious leaders with poor and low-wage workers walking arm in arm will engage in nonviolent moral direct action focused on the United States Senate. It's time for the pulpit and the street to come together, the preachers and the workers to come together. And if our actions result in the system believing it has to arrest us, then so be it. Civil disobedience is a badge and a banner we wear proudly when we stand up for what's morally right. But the time is now. We cannot declare the immoral reality that the democracy is in peril and then not engage with moral challenge and nonviolent direct action. They say in the climate justice movement, we have 9 years to take action before irreparable damage is done. Well, in the justice movement, we don't have any more time. Irreparable damage is being plotted and pushed right now. And we must escalate and engage the nonviolent moral struggle and direct action for a third Reconstruction, and we must do it now. And this, my friends, is no time for moderation. It's no time for unjust compromise and non-constitutional filibustering. Let me close here by reminding you of one more witness. One of my great historical heroes was a dear friend of Frederick Douglass. They had their challenges, but they were dear friends. His name was Reverend William Lloyd Garrison, a white brother who was a true Christian evangelical who knew Jesus and justice were synonyms. And Garrison was once arrested for refusing to accept the evil laws of slavery. He was arrested by, he said, a mob in Boston. He called them, he said, a respectable mob. And he was put in jail, and he said, I, William Lloyd Garrison, was arrested and put in jail for preaching the damnable gospel that all men are created equal. William Lloyd Garrison edited a newspaper in the 1840s and 1850s. In the very first issue of his anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison said something then we better hear now. This preacher said, I do not wish to think or speak or write moderately, as a moderate, with moderation. I'm aware that many object to the severity of my language. But is this not a cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject of slavery, I cannot be moderate. No, you go tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of a ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her baby from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in the cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch. And I will be heard. Why did Lord Garrison sound like this? Because he knew there are times when the fierce urgency of justice demands that we act now without compromise. And he did this long before even the Civil War. He spoke out. And if we use his symbolism today, the truth of the matter is the house of our democracy is on fire with greed and systemic racism and classism, ecological devastation, denial of health care, and the war economy and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. We can't be moderate. We tell the truth like a wife, like a man to rescue his wife from a ravisher. He would not do it moderately. Our democracy is being ravished. People are being ravished. They're being made prey. The poor are being raped. The low-wage people are being raped. Our voting rights are being grabbed and stolen and taken. There's no time for moderacy. And then he said, tell a mother to gradually extricate her baby from a fire. This democracy is still growing. It's not grown up. It still has work to do, even though it's some 100 years old in some ways, and in some ways it's still a baby, because it's clear that she's not grown out of racism. She's not grown out of greed and hate. And like a mother, if your baby is falling into a fire, you don't gradually take that baby out of the fire. You do everything you can to remove it, to save that baby's possibility, that baby's future. And so if Garrison rejected moderation then, we have to reject it now. There is no moderate position on voting rights. There is no moderate position on guaranteeing people a living wage and health care. Nobody, no state, no law can deny or bridge the right to vote, and nobody has the right to deny life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And every person has a right to equal protection under law. And when these things are under attack and being altered, we do not have a democracy. Our true Independence Day, if you want to tell the truth, was when the 14th and 15th Amendments redeemed the Constitution from its pro-slavery compromises and made a way for America to be born again, again and again and again. Born again through the women's suffrage movement, born again through the labor movement, born again through the civil rights movement. No democracy can be true to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness until workers are paid a living wage, until it has a provision in its Constitution that guarantees education and health care. And if a mean Mitch McConnell and one or two Democrats can put Supreme Court justices on the bench for lifetime appointments with 51 votes, surely we must demand that 51 votes be used to save the democracy, to ensure protection against voter suppression, and to pay people a $15 minimum wage. Manchin and Sinema, which side are you on? We cannot let them stay on the wrong side. It's time for nonviolent, moral, direct action and civil disobedience if necessary. Things must change by August the 6th, or we know what we must do all the way through to the midterm elections. We've got power. It's time right now. Forward together, not one step back. We must raise the alarm and engage the battle. We must sow the seeds of movement that refuses to accept autocracy. And this, my friends, we must understand now like never before, was never about one person. It's really about principles of a people. This was never just about an individual. It's a system that people have built, and it must be reconstructed. And poor and low-wealth voters alone hold 65 million votes. Only 34 million voted in this past election. 31 million didn't vote. If Trump had gotten 40,000 votes in 3 states combined, he would have won the Electoral College, but none of that has to be. If we engage now moral direct action, massive voter registration participation, massive litigation, and meaningful legislation, we are witnessing bloodletting from 1,000 cuts. That's what's wrong with the democracy right now. But it is now clearly evident that the lifeblood of this democracy could soon run out. And it's time to call a code. There must be a stoppage of the bleeding. We cannot tolerate business as usual. We must clear the way and let the ambulance drive us through. And we are those ambulance drivers, as Liz likes to say. And we must get this democracy into the emergency care room. It needs to go through intensive care. And we must love it enough to do it. We must stop the bleeding and make a more perfect union. That's what Sitting Bull hoped for. That's what Frederick and Harriet and William and Mother Jones and Caesar and Ann Braden and Dorothy and Rosa and Fannie Lou Hamer and Martin and Joshua and Malcolm and so many others. The list is too long. They fought for a more perfect union. They knew that there was a fierce urgency to make this nation get to the intensive care and the treatment it needed for the sicknesses of racism and poverty and injustice. They worked to create reconstructions. It's our time now. And so right now we must engage in their memory that this moment needs moral, nonviolent, direct action. This is the only hope for the moment, and the hope for our children is that we act right now. Democracy versus autocracy is the battle of our time. We must escalate and engage the nonviolent moral struggle for a third Reconstruction now, right now. If you desire to join, go to the Poor People's Campaign site and click on a third Reconstruction. It's time. Wherever you are, I keep saying it doesn't have to be under one banner, but it has to be a movement that says forward together, not one step back. And we will not give in and just go quietly away while we see this democracy, what's left of it, turn to an autocracy. When so many fought so hard to bring it forward, it's our time now. And I know we can do this. And when we save and improve this democracy, our children's children will retell the story of how we didn't back away, or we didn't give up on our principles, but we engaged the moral battle, and we stood on the right side of love. We stood on the right side of justice. We stood on the right side of truth. We stood on the right side of history. And we demanded that this nation be one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And they will tell the story that in our day when we had a choice to go backwards or forward, we chose forward together, not one step back. It's our time. It's our time. And the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is fully committed to starting and moving with all of our partners and thousands of clergy that are connected and young people and all of the coordinating committees. Join this moment and save this democracy from autocracy one more time. God bless you.